On March 14th, the Trump administration issued an executive order dismantling the U.S. Agency for Global Media, or USAGM, the federal agency overseeing U.S.-funded international media. The White House issued a press release saying that President Donald Trump's executive order will ensure that taxpayers are no longer on the hook for radical propaganda. There seems to be a trend of cutting fundings for public media around the world. So what does this mean for media organizations around the world? Would this trend have any ripple effects? And if so, what are the impacts? You're listening to The Divide. My name is Iris Xu.
My name's Harry Locke, and I am the Head of Content and Engagement for the Public Media Alliance.
Today we continue our conversation with Harry, who's been monitoring the ecosystem of public media for years. And here's Harry on how destructive it is to defund the U.S. Agency for Global Media.
It could be very destructive. So USAGM has been effectively dismantled, but I'm unsure of the extent to which it still exists. I think there are still people sort of working in DC who are tied to USAGM. So I think there is still a vehicle there. RFERL, Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty. So USAGM is the umbrella company, and then under that you have Voice of America, RFERL, and Radio Free Asia, and a couple of others as well.
Are they considered public media?
Yes, they are. So these companies, to varying extents, still exist. So I think Radio Free Asia, for a while after the funding cut, still tried to continue. Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty got a funding injection from the European Union to support the work that they do, but only in a particular number of countries. There were still a lot of layoffs in Europe for that service. And then Voice of America has been effectively shut down. So it's catastrophic for a number of reasons. The first one is to maybe just have a big picture of the international media ecosystem. So there are a number of big players who are involved in that space. So you have, if we think about authoritarian states, they are increasingly seeing international media as a way of shaping narrative, creating discourse, providing their perspective. It's not necessarily overt propaganda, although it can be, but it's about sort of setting their agenda. This is BBC analysis. They understand that between Russia and China, they spend about £8 billion a year on their global media strategies, collectively, £8 billion. In comparison, the World Service receives about £400 million. 400 million. The difference, the gulf between it's huge. Luckily, I think for organisations such as the World Service, for Radio France International, RFI, or France 24, Deutsche Welle, they have a legacy. They have an established brand. They have been active in various parts of the world. World Service across Africa, English-speaking Africa, RFI in Francophonie Africa. Deutsche Welle is really active in Latin America, places like that. So they have sort of different pockets of sort of strength and expertise. They are able to draw on that historical presence and that historical relationship that they have established with audiences. So I've spoken to various journalists and analysts recently across the world about what their perceptions are, and I think that is still true. So the influence of World Service and etc. is still very strong, but we are seeing a huge challenge in the shape of authoritarian states investing enormous amounts into their media strategies, as I mentioned, China and Russia, but you also have Iran putting huge amounts of money. You have Turkish state media, TRT, also investing heavily, or Saudi Arabia. So they are all getting into this space. What that then means when you have a service like Voice of America cut. So what services do USAGM provide? They have frequencies, they have TV stations, radio stations, etc., that are accessible in country. So you can watch Voice of America, or you can listen to Radio Free Asia. You can listen to the actual station. More importantly, maybe, they have agreements with local broadcasters to feature content, to have their content featured on that station. So they have literal spaces in their running orders where they're saying, oh, insert Voice of America news headline here, or Radio Free Asia news headline here, or Radio Free Asia current affairs program here. Those programs have gone. That has meant for local media who used to rely on this because maybe they're too small and they can't fill 24 hours, they've now got a gap in the schedule. what are they going to fill that with? Guess who's going to come along and fill it?
Corporate?
Well, Chinese.
Interesting.
Chinese and Russian state media. So in the years since, in the months since Radio Free Asia was shut down, Radio Free Asia operated about 60 radio frequencies. Those frequencies no longer exist, so they don't. You won't be able to hear Radio Free Asia content on those frequencies. In that same amount of time, China has expanded its operations onto 80 new frequencies. So while America has defunded their international media, China is only increasing its funding. So, I mean, it's of huge concern, as I mentioned, for sort of several different reasons. And then just maybe the last point to say is Chinese media is also investing heavily in establishing a lot of MOUs, cooperation agreements, content exchanges with local media as well. And the fact that you then have a withdrawal from the US in this space could just be, just devastating, really.
So basically, US is losing the international narrative aims, so to speak.
It's bizarre. I spoke to an academic based at UEA called Martin Scott, and he made this really good point about there's almost a conflict, right, in the White House. You have what used to be led by Musk, this sort of cut everything, government savings, efficiency, etc.
Doge.
On the other hand, you have America. We want to be big and we want to be out there and we want to be showing off and exercising our power. Now, what is an international media service but a tool of soft power to actually present the American values in the world in a democratic and independent way, which, to an extent, USAGM services did do. But within the White House, you had those two competing opinions sort of clash over USAGM because they don't necessarily marry up, and effectively Doge won. And so it's this big withdrawal, and as you say, it means that the US global voice, journalistic voice, no longer exists.
And the impact of this closure is not limited to influence, soft power. Article 19, an NGO advocating for the freedom of expression, says that the decision to cease funding the agency has sparked fears for the safety of staff working for the agency who are currently detained in countries openly hostile to press freedom and freedom of expression. Those countries include Belarus, Cambodia, China, North Korea, Laos, Russia, and Vietnam. At least 10 journalists reporting for the USAGM are currently in detention. And the organization said the executive order to stop funding USAGM outlets put these media workers at even greater risk, stripping them of vital protection and support for carrying out their work. And while these USAGM media workers are facing risks of detention, authoritarian states like China are signing MOUs with local media outlets to expand influence.
It's very much in countries in the global south. So we're seeing it largely in Africa. Across Africa. We are seeing it in the Pacific and in Latin America as well. They're able to sign these agreements and they also offer cultural exchanges. So there's also a huge benefit, particularly for journalists in the global south, for an international trip, and that's then training. This isn't a new tool. Like the World Service used to do this. France Media Monde used to do this. Deutsche Welle used to do this.
Are they no longer?
Don't think so, but I'm not. But they could be. So apologies, I don't know the answer to that. But what China's doing, and I think that there was recently a sort of a big global gathering of journalists from sort of across the global south in Beijing. I think the difference, obviously, is that when journalists arrive at the World Service, my particular opinion is that the World Service will impart lessons of independence, impartiality, accuracy. I don't have the confidence that that is what's being done from training in China.
And not only in China. Today, Turkey is witnessing its most severe crackdown on independent journalism since the failed coup in 2016. On the Press Freedom Day, the International Press Institute, European Center for Press and Media Freedom, and Committee to Protect Journalists urged Turkish authorities to cease all attacks against journalists and protect press freedom. And according to the annual South Asia Press Freedom Report, in India, media outlets have been shackled and subjected to a systemic strategy to cripple it.
In Turkey and in India, public media is already very tightly controlled.
I see.
It already has a pretty close alignment with the respective governments of both countries. In India, there is also what I would describe as a huge problem in that Akashvani, which is the state radio network, broadcasts news. No community radio station, no other radio station, community, commercial, is allowed to broadcast news. It has to carry the news from Akashvani. I mean, that is unbelievable. There is no pluralism in the radio landscape because all of its news comes from one source, and it is the state media source. So that's hugely problematic. You mentioned there as well that sort of, I mean, we saw it in Hungary. It was called the urbanization of media. Viktor Orban basically did the same. The former Polish Prime Minister tried to do the same. You try and pass laws which makes illegal foreign ownership of media companies. So media companies, it was called TVN in Poland. I think it was owned by a US company, but I can't remember who exactly it was. They tried to pass this law that would have made TVN owners have to sell the station. Now, who's going to buy that station? Oh, an ally of the government. That's exactly what happened in Hungary. I don't know quite how it worked, but in NDTV, New Delhi Television is what it was formerly known as in India, it was bought out by a big Modi ally. I'm not quite sure why it was put up for sale or if there was any sort of similar moves by the government to sort of force that sale. But there are sort of ways in which you can sort of, just capture the media, which is really alarming, and it is a threat to independent public media. The caveat I would say is that public media independence doesn't necessarily exist in those two countries. In the US, however, I mean, to sort of go back to what Trump's done, not only has he defunded their international service, he's also defunded their domestic services. So public media had a 2-year advanced funding rate of, I can't quite remember how much, but basically Trump put through a rescission package that then took away that funding. That's federal funding that is basically distributed. So his ire, his unhappiness with public media was largely directed towards NPR and PBS, that are the national networks. But public media in the US is very different. They've got these national networks, but they're basically just content producers. And what they do is distribute that content to a whole network of local, regional, city-based, town-based, village-based, community-based radio stations who then rely on that content. So that's where you get to hear NPR or you get to watch PBS is through those local stations. There is now no federal funding for those stations that existed and relied so heavily. They operate off sort of private-public partnerships, so they also rely on donations and philanthropy to sort of survive. But that federal, especially for community, rural, indigenous stations as well, that federal funding was so critical, and now it's gone. So that's just another blow really to the media system of America.
I see. I remember we met each other in 2023, and at the time we were both attending Radio Days Asia. I met a guy who works for NPR. He was telling me that there's been a funding deficit basically at NPR, and I remember that was during the Biden administration, so the funding was already scarce. And now it's been even more difficult.
Yeah. Well, I think if we think of a positive out of this, if there's not really one, but if we try and think of a positive, it's that, and if we also circle back to the conversation at the start, which is talking about relevance and the challenge facing public media in the US now gets to go away and there will be cuts, there will be pain. But it gets to say, okay, how can we reinvent ourselves? Let's say, hopefully at some point, we'll see some federal funding returned. NPR will be fine, by the way. They've got funding systems in place where they'll be able to carry through. They might have to reduce, they might sort of have to go down to a bit of a skeleton operation, but they will continue to exist. The same can't be said for a lot of local stations that will probably effectively cease operations. NPR gets to go away and actually sit down and think, okay, we're going to have to go through some pain, we're going to have to make some changes. How can we do it? And how can we come out the other end and actually be an organisation that is perfectly aligned with what is required in this current media environment, current matching consumption habits. That's quite an exciting proposition, I think. It has also meant, and you've seen this, so there has been a large increase in the amount of public donations towards public media stations.
Really?
People didn't realise what they were missing, what they were going to lose, until it was there. The threat of it being taken away from them was right there, and people stepped up. It's not going to match the federal funding that was required, so it's not going to fill that gap, but it's something, and it just shows people really care about it, and it's really positive. There's also been, the Knight Foundation has also launched a fund, and they're looking to raise $50 million to support local regional public media stations. So, there are glimmers of hope, and I think that the two things, as I mentioned, NPR and PBS sort of being able to sort of reassess and reevaluate and come back stronger, and the second thing is just being able to see that groundswell of public support and actually then be able to like go on this huge drive and be in the news. The New York Times came out with an op-ed talking about why we need public media. That's huge, to have the foremost newspaper in the world sort of come out with that sort of strong statement and just sort of really shine a spotlight on what NPR and PBS do that is so critical for US democracy.
I see. Meanwhile, there's no hope for VOA and RFA because they're not really domestic.
Yeah, sadly not. Really. I mean, I struggle to think of a way in which that could be revitalized. The really sad thing as well, audiences are achieved and won over generations, over years, through decades long. People establish relationships with them, and often it comes from childhood, and being able to sort of be seen through childhood and have that content driven for children. And then as you grow older and older, that's gone. And once, and you can come back 5 years later and you can, maybe launch a new radio station or launch a new podcast, but you've lost that audience for 5 years. Are you going to be able to get them back? Not necessarily, not easily.
And that will lead us to the end of our interview. But before we go, is there anything you would like to add?
I could add one thing maybe, which is around innovation. And I think we're sort of standing we're not on the precipice, because I think we're maybe already past the precipice of just really realizing how young audiences in particular just aren't relating to public media at the moment. How do we win them back? And I think it's going to require bravery and experimentation. So one area I'm really interested in is the growing importance of content creators. But as I mentioned before, they don't have very high levels of media literacy or journalistic training. Is there an opportunity to collaborate, to cooperate, to sort of recognize, okay, content creators, we know you're very good at reaching this particular audience that we don't reach. We know you know your audience super well. You know exactly what stories they want to hear, how they want to hear it. We don't know that. But we have things that we can offer you. We have formal training, media literacy training. We can train you how to fact check. We can provide you with production expertise, give you exposure to different production techniques, expose you to a whole newsroom, a whole team behind you. That's a pretty enticing offer from my position. I understand many content creators would be like, why on earth would I bother? That's fair enough. But I think some will be interested in that opportunity. So is that an area in which public media can start to move? I think there are still major questions around that, because do you even then begin to sort of build a relationship with your brand, or do you just sort of leverage off a relationship that a content creator already has with an audience? So it's not perfect, but I just think these sorts of projects, and those sorts of projects have happened, they are happening. The ABC has a creator program, BBC has a creator program, RTBF, Belgian broadcaster, France Télévisions, have worked with the biggest content creators in France and Belgium on sort of news documentary style programs. So there are ways in which it can sort of work, but yeah, it's going to take more sort of experimentation to sort of get it really working.
And that is it for this week's episode of The Divide. Thank you for listening. This episode is produced by Radio Taiwan International.